Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating spiritual message. It's one that takes ancient scripture and bridges it directly to the modern lifestyle of Generation Z. You know, if you've ever wondered how texts written thousands of years ago could possibly speak to the hyper-connected, fast-paced world we live in today, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to unpack a narrative that challenges our daily routines and asks us to look just a little closer at what we're actually building with our lives.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a deeply provocative question raised right at the beginning of our source material. What does Jesus think about Gen Z? Like, how does the biblical narrative view today's youth? It's a pretty bold framing, right? We aren't just talking about abstract historical theology here. We're talking about a direct lens applied to the current generation. A generation that's known for its incredible potential, sure, but also for facing some unprecedented real-world distractions.
Section 1. The Days of Noah. An ancient parallel to modern times.
To answer that opening question, the source actually points us way back in time, specifically to the book of Matthew, chapter 24, which draws a direct comparison between Gen Z and the people living during the historical days of Noah. If we look at Genesis chapter 6, the text outlines this really clear progression. The human population expanded, which then led to this bizarre and corrupting intersection where spiritual beings married humans. And this union, well, it caused human wickedness to just dramatically increase, and ultimately, it broke God's heart. The text highlights that the problem wasn't just that people existed, but that their focus became completely consumed by earthly and often corrupt desires. They just totally lost sight of any higher spiritual reality.
Section 2. The Burning House. Cognitive Dissonance in Tragic Times.
So to explain why the everyday actions of that ancient generation became such a massive problem, the speaker uses a brilliantly jarring metaphor. I want you to really picture this for a second. Imagine walking over to your neighbor's house, and the house is literally engulfed in flames. The family is standing outside, weeping, absolutely grieving because they've lost a child in the fire. And you walk right up to them and ask, "Excuse me, can you give me a matchbox? I want to make tea." Or asking for a cup of sugar to make some sweets. I mean, it sounds completely absurd, right? It's just horribly, horribly insensitive.
But that brilliantly illustrates the core cognitive dissonance the source is trying to communicate here. On one hand, we have normal, everyday actions, right? Eating, drinking, getting married, maybe buying a new bike. Now, none of these things are inherently evil, but the tragic context is doing these things while completely ignoring the figurative fire raging all around you. It's like ignoring your parents' deep financial or health struggles just to get what you want, or ignoring God's broken heart. That cognitive dissonance, being totally obsessed with normal, everyday pleasures while remaining completely oblivious to a massive spiritual tragedy, that's the real core issue being presented.
Fortunately, the story doesn't end with everyone being completely oblivious. Noah and his 3 sons actually chose differently. The source emphasizes that they lived in the exact same environment, surrounded by the exact same culture as everyone else, yet they resisted it. They didn't get sucked into that spiritual corruption. Instead, they aligned themselves with a much higher calling. They actually paid attention to the fire, so to speak, and decided to step up and take action rather than just going about their daily business.
Section 3. Then versus now. What is being built?
So, what does this all mean for us? How does this ancient narrative translate to our modern era, especially looking toward the year 2026 and beyond? The source draws a really direct historical parallel for us. Back in the days of Noah, the impending threat was water, the flood, and God's project at that specific time was building the ark. Now, fast forward to today, representing the modern era, the source suggests the impending biblical threat is fire, and God's current project is building the church. And we're not just talking about a physical brick-and-mortar building, but a massive spiritual community. So just as Noah built the ark, today's generation is being called upon to build the church.
Section 4. Taking on the burden, redefining responsibility.
Now, to actively participate in this building process, the speaker challenges Gen Z to take on a burden, but framing it as a noble responsibility. I know, the word burden usually has a super negative connotation, right? We automatically think of stress or feeling weighed down. But our source material completely redefines this concept. To really drive this home, they share a fascinating anecdote about a young Queen Elizabeth. Even when she was just a small child in early primary school, she acted with extreme discipline. Like if she saw trash on the ground, she picked it up. And when teachers told her to just go play carelessly like all the other kids, she actually refused. She explained that she carried the massive weight of her future kingdom on her head. She knew, even then, she couldn't live a careless, distracted life because she had a truly grand responsibility waiting for her.
Next, we hear this incredibly grounding story about a modern college student who has just a grueling daily schedule. We're talking waking up at 4 a.m. to deliver papers and milk,
doing heavy physical labor at the local vegetable market, then going to attend college classes, only to return to the market and work right up until nightfall. This young man completely ignores the typical youth distractions. There's no movies, no dating, no hanging out aimlessly with friends.
So, a professor gets curious about this extreme level of dedication, investigates the student's background, and uncovers a pretty tragic reality. It turns out the student has a paralyzed father, a mother suffering from tuberculosis, and a sister battling severe mental illness. This young man carries the absolute burden of his family's very survival right on his shoulders. And that heavy reality? It leaves absolutely zero room for selfish or oblivious living.
Both of these stories build up to a really powerful redefinition. A burden, at least in this spiritual context, means taking absolute responsibility for others and for a noble calling. It's about prioritizing that calling over personal comfort and trivial distractions. It's not a punishment. It's presented as an act of profound maturity and an act of deep sacrificial love.
The speaker also brings in another biblical figure, Nehemiah. When Nehemiah was tasked with rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, his enemies actively tried to distract him. They kept inviting him to feasts and parties, basically telling him to take a break. But Nehemiah flat out refused. He essentially said, "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down." It shows that true focus requires saying no to seemingly harmless distractions if you want to complete something genuinely monumental.
Section 5. The ultimate choice. What will Gen Z choose?
And this brings us right to the climax of the source material's message for today's youth. The listener is presented with a stark, binary choice. One path is living obliviously for oneself, right? Eating, drinking, obsessing over the latest trends while totally ignoring the bigger picture. The source warns that this path ultimately spoils the future, much like that generation swept away in the days of Noah. The other path, though, is choosing to take on God's burden. By actually shouldering the responsibility to care for others and build up the spiritual community, you end up saving not just yourself, but the people around you.
The message then concludes with a really beautiful invitation from the book of Matthew, chapter 11, where Jesus says, "Come to me, give your burdens, and take my weight." The source is essentially encouraging youth to hand over their worldly, toxic anxieties, the stress of fitting in, the intense pressure of superficial success, and exchange all of that for a structured, deeply meaningful spiritual purpose. It's presented as trading a completely pointless load for a purposeful, life-giving responsibility.
Ultimately, the source leaves us with this incredibly powerful echoing thought. The ark was built back then to save people from the flood. The church, that spiritual community, is being built right now to save people from the figurative fires of our modern age. So in a world that is just incredibly distracted, what will you dedicate your life to building? It's the kind of question that really demands we look past our screens and step into our true purpose. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I genuinely hope this leaves you with something profound to think about today.